First time. It's always good to be here this morning to praise the Lord. This morning we are in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 20. And actually I'm going to start a couple of verses before chapter 20 because, as I am so fond of pointing out chapter divisions in the Bible that aren't very good, this is a chapter division that might have been better placed than it is because it prefaces the situation of Jesus in these disputes with the scribes by talking about their plan to trap him and destroy him in what he was saying. Of course, in the latter part of chapter 19, we had the triumphal entry. Jesus comes into the city of Jerusalem, and everything looks good at first. It looks like the people of Jerusalem are going to accept Jesus. They're welcoming him. Perhaps they think of him as their king. They pray and they sing, "Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And that sounds good on the surface. But the problem is that they are merely proclaiming peace, peace, while there is no actual peace. Because as Jesus approaches the city of Jerusalem, he says, "Oh, if you had only known the things that make for peace," in verse 42. In verses 43 and 44, he describes a time that comes when the armies will come to Jerusalem and throw up ramps against her and tear down every stone because she did not recognize the hour of her visitation. And then he goes into the temple and he disrupts what they're doing there, turning over the tables of the money changers and saying that you have taken this house of prayer and you have transformed it into a den of robbers. Well, I imagine if Jesus came into a church building like this and started kicking over pews and turning over tables and accusing us of things like that, not everybody would take kindly to that sort of behavior. And the chief priests do not take kindly to Jesus' behavior either. But I want to look at verses 47 and 48 again, because really what I think is going on here is a shift in who Jesus' opponents are. As he was teaching daily in the temple, and the chief priests and the scribes and the leading men among the people were trying to destroy him, and they could not find anything that they might do, for all the people were hanging on to every word that he said. Now, here's a pop quiz. What is the group of people that Jesus has been disputing with all throughout the Gospel of Luke? Don's mouthing the word at me. Pharisees, right. Non-stop throughout the Gospel of Luke, Jesus has been in an argument with the Pharisees. Okay, that's going to drive an OCD person like me nuts if I don't fix this right now. There. Thank you for being patient with me in my adjustments of things like that. Non-stop arguments with the Pharisees all throughout Luke. We're not going to read all of these passages up here. This is just to impress upon you the sheer number of times that Jesus has been in an argument with the Pharisees after this point. Now here's the next question. How many times are the Pharisees mentioned after chapter 19 and verse 39? None. None at all. The Pharisees are never mentioned again. Where did they go? Now the other Gospels do not. The other Gospels do something very similar to this, but Luke is definitely the most obvious about it. Instead, from this point, Jesus is arguing with the chief priests and the scribes, the chief priests and the rulers, and in one instance the Sadducees, which most of the priests actually were Sadducees in those days. There's a little historical tidbit for you. What happened? Why the reason for this shift here? I would say this, that in spite of the fact that Jesus has rampant disagreements with the Pharisees, they were probably the one Jewish group that existed in that day that was closer to what Jesus was teaching than other groups would have been. And he's the one they criticized the most. What does that say? Well, it says those who think themselves to be righteous and think themselves to be without need of a physician are probably the most in need of one. But the Pharisees, like Jesus, accepted the prophets as Scripture. The Pharisees, like Jesus, believed that there was a thing called the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees did not believe in those things. Many of the chief priests in Jerusalem did not hold to those teachings either. Instead, what happened? Well, he comes to Jerusalem, he goes into the temple, and he provokes a new enemy. An enemy that becomes increasingly more determined to kill him than the chief priests who run the sacrificial system. In Luke 6 and verse 11, the Pharisees merely discussed what they might do to Jesus. In Luke 11 and verses 53 and 54, the Pharisees are planning to trap him in his words. But in Luke 19, it's the chief priests who actually plot to destroy him. And if you'll recall, this is actually in line with Jesus' prediction in chapter 9 and verse 22. In chapter 9 and verse 22, what does he say? After Peter's confession, "You are the Christ of God," he warns them not to tell anyone, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised up on the third day." That, I think, is a historical thing we need to get clear in our minds. You know, it isn't like the guys that Jesus has been arguing with all throughout Galilee suddenly just chased him to Jerusalem and started this big riot in the city and had him crucified. That's not exactly the way it went down. What went down is Jesus came into Jerusalem and the city of Jerusalem rejected him. The leaders, the religious leaders, the chief priests, the scribes who were there rejected him. And after a series of arguments, they finally decide to do away with him. And it occurred to me, after looking at this outline and putting together this presentation, I realized that the argument that Jesus has with them is so lengthy in Luke's Gospel that we may not get to it all today. So I may wind up having to break this into 2 lessons, in which case you get the short sermon today. I'm not making any promises, though. I'll just say it that way. There's the basic argument that takes place. The first thing that happens is in verses 1 through 8 of chapter 20. On one of the days, while he was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders confronted him. And they spoke, saying to him, "Tell us, by what authority you are doing these things? Or who is the one who gave you this authority?" And Jesus answered and said to him, "I will also ask you a question. And you tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from men?" They reasoned among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from men, all of the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, "Nor will I tell you by what authority I do these things." You know, what is the basis of this question? You know, what is your authority? Where is your authority? You know, the word authority just basically means, in this instance we're talking about rights. What gives you the right to do this, we might say in our modern language? The Jewish leaders asked this question of Jesus. Jesus had just kicked their money changers out of the temple. I guess that probably raises a question, a valid question to be sure, but one that Jesus refuses to answer. Why? Well, because these people already know the answer to their question, really. Jesus answers their question with the question. Where did John's immersion come from? When John was going around immersing people in water in the Jordan River, where did he get the right to do that? Where did that come from? Was that something that, John was just sitting under a coconut tree one day and thought up and said, I think it'll be fun to baptize people? Or was it something that came as a divine directive from heaven? There's only 2 places John could have gotten the right to do that. He could have gotten it from heaven, i.e. from God, or he could have gotten it from men, which is anywhere else. And guess what? Those 2 answers are the same 2 possible answers to the question that the Pharisees, I'm messing this up even, that the chief priests asked Jesus. Where could Jesus have gotten the right to drive the money changers out of the temple? Well, one place he could have gotten it was from men. He could have, maybe himself or maybe some other person or whatnot, he could have just decided one day, I feel like kicking over some tables and yelling at people and beating them with a rope made of cords. Or he could have gotten it from heaven. It could have been a divine directive. Now, Jesus is God in the flesh, so anything he comes up with is automatically from heaven. But, we get where we're going with this is there's only 2 places Jesus' rights can come from heaven or from men. Well, of course, the Pharisees are unable to answer their own question. I did it again, didn't I? I really stepped in it when I made that first point. Now I'm creating a trouble. Not the Pharisees. the chief priests can't answer their own question. The issue is not their lack of knowledge, but rather their unwillingness to admit to the wrong. This is the real problem, isn't it? It's not that they can't answer the question. Do they have an opinion about where John's immersion came from? Well, yeah, they do. Are they willing to state to the public what that opinion is? No, they're not. Because if we tell them what we really think, that he was from men, then all the people are going to stone us, and our approval rating is going to go down, and nobody's going to like us. And slick politicians that we are, well, we can't turn around and say it was from heaven and keep the people happy, because then Jesus is going to call us out on our little flip-flop. So what are we going to do? Well, we'll just go with plausible deniability. Say we don't really know. But we don't really know we don't know how to answer that, Jesus. Well, fine. I don't know how to answer your question then. I'm not going to answer your question either. They're the same question. Because Jesus was the one that John proclaimed. Answering the question of whether John's immersion was from heaven or from men also answers the question of where Jesus got the right to do this. Because the two of them were working together. John was the one who proclaimed Jesus and prepared the way for him. John was the one who immersed him. And then the heavens were open and the Spirit descended as a dove. You can't answer one, I'm not answering the other. It's a no-brainer. So Jesus then tells a parable about these stubborn religious leaders. He began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey for a long time. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers so that they would give him some of the produce of the vineyard. But the vine growers beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he proceeded to send another slave, and they beat him also and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he proceeded to send a third, and this one also they wounded and cast out. The owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." When the vine growers saw him, they reasoned with one another, saying, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, so that the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy these vine growers and will give the vineyard to others. When they heard it, they said, "May it never be!" But Jesus looked at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. But on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust." Okay, now this parable also appears in Matthew and Mark. In fact, almost everything we're reading appears somewhere in Matthew and Mark as well. Luke omits a lot of details and kind of shrinks the wording a little bit to get it to fit. But, for instance, he leaves out the allusions to Isaiah's prophecy concerning the vineyard of Israel. But in many ways, this parable is similar to other warnings that have been given. In Luke 12, Jesus talked about the need for the servants, the faithful servants that the master leaves in charge of the house, to be watchful and ready for him to return. Don't beat your fellow slaves, or your master will return in an hour which you do not know and assign you a place with the evildoers. Well, what happens in this parable, the farmer plants a vineyard, he rents it out, and at the harvest time he sends servant after servant to the vineyard to try to collect some of the produce and talk to these vine growers, and, well, nobody wants to listen. And what is this about? Well, this is, you might say this is comparable to the prophets that God sent. The many prophets that God sent to Israel over and over, begging the nation to repent, entreating them that they might return to God's favor. It's like Jesus said in chapter 11 in verses 47 through 51. "Woe to you, because you build the tombs of the prophets, and it was your fathers who killed them. So you are witnesses and approve the deeds of your fathers, because it was they who killed them, and you build their tombs. For this reason also the wisdom of God said, I will send to them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill, and some of them they will persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the house of God. Yes, I tell you, it shall be charged against this generation." Now God has sent all these prophets to the nation, And they've killed them one after the other. And this current generation that Jesus is in has the audacity to say, oh, well, we would never act like that. You know, historical arrogance. That's what that is. That is this idea that, oh, well, we somehow learned from the mistakes of the past. We're better than they are now. And Jesus says you're about to do the same thing. As a last resort, the master sends his son. Surely they will listen to the son of the vineyard's owner, right? Well, the vine growers instead have this brilliant idea to kill the son, and they think that somehow they can make off with this inheritance by doing this. Because the master surely will reward us for killing his son. That's going to work so well. And Jesus here is obviously foreshadowing what they intend to do to him. Here he is. Jesus predicts his own death in this parable. This parable makes everybody very mad, and then they try to kill him. Imagine the irony of that. And Jesus here answers the question, what will the vine grower do? Well, he will destroy them. He will take away their stewardship and give it to others. That responsibility they had of watching the vineyard, they've proven they cannot be trusted. They are not faithful servants. I will take it away from them and I will give it to people who are better equipped to manage it. Well, what's that talking about? Implicitly, Jesus is, again, making a comment about the Gentile inclusion in the people of God. Once again, hinting that they will have a stake in the kingdom. He's already done this at least twice that I can recall in Luke chapter 4 and in Luke chapter 13. Well, the crowd hears this statement. And they're not completely foolish. They do know what this parable is about. They hear this description of the vineyard being taken away and given to others, and they respond, may it never be. Let's argue with that for a minute. Well, do they perceive Jesus' implied point? Do they think it absurd that they would behave like these vine growers? What does Jesus think? Well, Jesus goes right back to the Scripture. Psalm 118:22. The stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone. Now, Psalm 118 has already been quoted once in this passage, back in chapter 19, when Jesus entered into Jerusalem, and they said, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. That's a line from Psalm 118:26. It kind of taps in. But here Jesus talks about this rock, this stone that was rejected by the builders but has become the very important cornerstone, the part of the foundation that is most essential to the building itself. It's not the first time that the rock theme appears in Scripture. It's all over the Old Testament. You think of Deuteronomy 32 where God is described as Israel's rock and yet they reject Him. You think of Daniel chapter 2, the uncut stone that strikes at the feet of the statue and then grows into a mountain and fills the earth. Well, Jesus is the stone that the builders rejected here. And yet He is the one that becomes chief. The stone is so great that it destroys anyone on whom it falls. And it is so great that anyone who falls on it is destroyed. Like the uncut stone of Daniel 2, there is not a man in this world, there is not a kingdom in this world, there is not a nation in this world that will not have to yield to Jesus. And there's not a nation in this world that Jesus will not, there's not a nation in this world that Jesus will have to yield to. The ultimate weapon in the cosmic game of rock, paper, scissors is rock. Rock always wins. It's really a response to the rock theme. Well, this rock theme, it's really a response to the crowd statement, may it never be. He's the chief cornerstone. He's the supreme authority. You don't argue with Jesus. It is us who must yield to His statements. It is not His statements that must yield to us. When Jesus says something that sounds difficult for us to swallow, when Jesus says something that sounds difficult for us to accept, what has to change? Well, we can't change what Jesus said. We can't change what God says. We are the ones who have to yield and change our lives to conform to His will. We cannot say to God, may it never be, at an outrageous statement that He makes, a statement that may seem outrageous to us. On the contrary, it is our lives that must conform to His will. The only real outrage is that human beings think they know better than God. Well, Jesus has a knack for saying parables that people don't understand. They understood this one. And verse 19 says, Verse 19, the scribes and the chief priests tried to lay hands on him that very hour, and they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke this parable against them. They're not happy about this. So what happens next? Well, it prompts hatred from them. It prompts an attempt to trap Jesus in a statement he might make. In verse 20, I'm going to read verses 20 through 26. They watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous in order that they might catch him in some statement so that they could deliver him to the rule and the authority of the governor. They questioned him saying, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach correctly and you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But he detected their trickery and said to them, "Show me a denarius whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were unable to catch him in a saying in the presence of the people, and being amazed at his answer, they became silent. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? It's a trick question, isn't it? Because, if Jesus says no, then they can hand him over to the Roman governor as an insurrectionist. And if Jesus says yes, they can discredit him in front of all of his followers who are anti-Roman. It's the perfect trap to put him into. No matter what happens, Jesus is going to displease some of his constituency, and we've won. We've chiseled away at his popularity. Interestingly, in Luke 23 and verse 2, when Jesus is on trial, they actually misquote Jesus on this point and say, "He was forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar," which is the opposite of what Jesus actually answers. Jesus says, yes, his followers might riot, they might stop trusting that Jesus is the Messiah. They had this idea that the Messiah was there to overthrow the Romans and defeat them. And worse, the Roman coins deified the emperor. So maybe they could, twist Jesus' words enough to get him to say that he supports the emperor cult. No. It's the perfect trap. How's Jesus going to get out of this? Well, verse 23, he makes them answer their own question. I love this. He detects their trickery. He detects what they are doing. And he says, okay, whose inscription is this? It's Caesar's. Who does this money belong to? Caesar. So give Caesar what is his. And what about God? Well, it's analogous to God, really. Give God what is his. Hints at underlying principle that God is the one who establishes government in the first place. This is a classic problem. There is no biblical justification to get out of paying taxes. The human logic loves to do this. Human logic says, the government supports things that are wrong, like unjust wars and abortion and homosexual marriages and things like that. So I shouldn't pay taxes to the government because I won't be supporting them. Yeah. Well, you know what the problem with that logic is? Jesus said, pay your taxes. That's what the problem with it is. This is how Jesus' authority works. We can't use human logic to circumvent that. Paul said in Romans 13, pay your taxes. We pay taxes for this reason. Oh man, some people want to pick and choose what passages belong in the Bible, and want to pick and choose and cut things out that they don't like. Oh man, if we were allowed to do that, Romans 13 would be the first passage to go, because I don't like paying my taxes. That's not a fun passage to follow, but the Lord said it. I have to obey it. That settles the discussion. Things that I don't like that are in the Bible, that's at the top of the list. But you know what? No matter how bad the government gets, it doesn't change what Jesus said. This is said in the context of the Roman government. Was the Roman government more or less corrupt than the one we have right now? It was more corrupt, is what it was. It was more autocratic. It was more corrupt. They didn't give their citizens a say in what went on. There was an emperor. He could do whatever he wanted. You talk about presidents that support homosexuality. They had emperors who were homosexuals. You think about that. That's kind of out there. More more autocratic, more corrupt. There are far worse governments than, I like to complain about the government too, but we're very blessed. We need to count our blessing on that point. We're very blessed that we are not mistreated for our faith. We're very blessed that Christians are not hung on crosses and burned alive. We're very blessed that none of us have ever been fed to lions. I think we're doing pretty well, all things considered. If Jesus could, and Paul, in a system far worse than ours, could say, pay your taxes, well, that would provide a stern warning against using our human logic in this environment. And that's what I'll say about that. That was obviously a tangent, but it says something about how we view God's authority. So it is relevant to how we approach this lesson in general. Then in verses 27 through 40, what about the resurrection? I wanted to say, what about resurrection and levirate marriage, but that didn't fit on the slide. There came to him some of the Sadducees who say that there is no resurrection, and they questioned him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies having a wife, and he is childless, his brother should marry the wife and raise up children to his brother. Now there were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died childless, and the second and the third married her, and in the same way all 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died also. In the resurrection, therefore, which one's wife will she be? For all 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot even die anymore, because they are like angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the burning bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living. For all live to him. Some of the scribes answered and said, Teacher, you have spoken well. But they did not have courage to question him any longer about anything. Boy, one thing you don't do, you don't get into an argument with Jesus. You will lose. And what he does here is he exposes their false view of God. Let's look at their question for a minute. The Sadducees would ask this question because they deny the resurrection. We don't have a lot of writings from the Sadducees themselves because, frankly, most of them were destroyed in AD 70 when Jerusalem was. They were a Jewish religious sect. They were frequently rivals of the Pharisees. They only believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy. They tended to be pro-Roman in their politics, and they liked to side with the government on a lot of things. They were very centralized in Jerusalem. You wouldn't find... the Sadducees are almost never mentioned outside of Jerusalem in the Gospels. They are very limited to that location. Almost all the priests were Sadducees, very much unlike the Pharisees, who tended to be everywhere in the empire. And this is why, we don't see much of them until we get to the end of the Gospels, because Jesus isn't in Jerusalem until the end of the Gospels. They did not believe in angels, and they did not believe in the resurrection. I don't know how they don't believe in angels if they believed in the first 5 books of Moses, but, I'm just repeating what they believe. I'm not saying that they made sense. A ridiculous question. They took the law of levirate marriage in Deuteronomy 25, which says that that if a man died and he didn't leave any children, his wife would go to his brother, who would then have to raise up a child in his name. And that's a law that goes behind a lot of the circumstances in the book of Ruth as well. Anyhow, they quote this scenario, a scenario that's oddly similar to one in the book of Tobit, actually, in the Apocrypha, which describes how one woman marries 7 brothers in succession and not one of them produces a child, so this law keeps kicking in until she's dead as well. In passing, Luke's version of this story has a great memory verse. In verse 30 and the second, we got Jesus wept in John 11:35. You got rejoice always in 1 Thessalonians 5:16. You've got and the second in Luke 20 verse 30. So if those 2 got taken for memory verse, there's the third one. Really don't understand verse divisions there. Anyhow, they present this ridiculous scenario, and then they say, okay, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? She can't be the wife of 7 husbands. Apparently the Jews believed that polygamy was okay, but polyandry was not. So what's left? well, we've got is 7 men fighting over one woman. It's designed to make the resurrection look ridiculous and ludicrous. And the question is hypothetically ridiculous. It's similar to these man on a desert island scenarios that people like to bring up. Technically possible, but highly implausible. Jesus answers by exposing how they not only do not understand the Scriptures, they don't even understand the power of God. They have got the complete wrong idea about who God is. Here's the way it works. In the present age, people marry and they're given in marriage. In the next age, marriage doesn't exist. Why? Well, because there's no more death, verse 36, because they are like angels and are sons of God. And, the point here, it's kind of funny, Jesus brings this up, the Sadducees don't even believe in angels. He's pushing all of their buttons here. The idea is that, not that, marriage was a broken institution, we're not going to have it in the next life. That's not the point. The point is that marriage is trivialized by the closeness of the relationships that we have in the resurrection of the dead. And you think about that for a second. The closest, most intimate relationship that can exist between two humans on the face of the earth right now is that of marriage. Jesus says there's something bigger and better than eclipses that puts that away. Jesus answers the question behind the question, proof of the resurrection of the dead. We know that the resurrection happens. Why? Well, Jesus could go to a lot of different scriptures to prove that. He could have gone to passages in the prophets to prove that, or passages in the Psalms. But where does he go? He goes to their Bible. He goes to Exodus, of all places, probably the last place that you or I would think to look if we were trying to prove the resurrection. And he simply says, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is not, some people preach that this is an argument from the present tense, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That only works if you're reading Matthew's account, because Mark omits the verb, he implies it, and Luke words it in such a way that it can't be an argument from the present tense. But Jesus' argument is a truism. God is not the God of the dead. He is the God of the living. He is the God of life. He is the God who gives and takes life. He calls himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on numerous occasions. The burning bush is just one, for instance. Therefore, either Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are already alive right now. There's a sense in which they've already been resurrected since all lived to him. Alternatively, we could say that this means that in the final analysis they have to be resurrected for God's statement to be true. Because if God is going to be if God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then they can't be dead in the final analysis, can they? At the very end, there has to be a resurrection of the dead for that statement to hold true, because he is the God of the living and not the God of the dead. That is how we know about the resurrection. Oh, that was the next slide. Okay, how did we... I'm just going to stop there. False view of God exposed. We probably don't have time to get into the next part where Jesus offers his own rebuttal. I'm going to close the lesson with this. I would invite you to take out your songbooks as we consider some of these other things. Our life is one that revolves around the resurrection of the dead. We do not live our lives for this present world. If all we are doing is living our lives simply, to get as far ahead as we can in life, to climb the ladder as high as we can, to get the best education we possibly can, to make the most money we possibly can, we're living for the wrong thing. If we live our life with this philosophy that the world has, that the man who dies with the most toys wins, I've got some bad news for you. It's not a good way to live your life. I mean, when we're dead, you don't typically see the U-Haul following the hearse. You don't take that stuff with you. But there's something bigger and better that awaits us in the next life. In this life we have pain, we have suffering, we have sin. We have families that are torn apart. We have people that die in tragedies that can't be explained. We have natural disasters. We have political upheavals. We have all sorts of discontentment. And those problems will not be resolved by voting the right people into office, by making the right forms of protests, by, treating ourselves with the right kinds of drugs. Those problems are not resolved by the means of this world. In order to resolve it, we need something from the next world to help us. That is Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Do we adopt the philosophy of the Sadducees in our lives? Are we spiritual Sadducees? Sometimes you see the accusation thrown around, oh, you're just a Pharisee, and it's usually derogatory in term. What about being a Sadducee? Can we be a spiritual Sadducee? Can we be someone who lives as if this world were all that mattered? As if the things of this life were all that mattered? As if the present Zion, the city of Jerusalem in which they lived, was the perfection and the end goal of all that God had hoped to accomplish? And that true power was to be found simply by negotiating with the high powers that be in their world, the humans. Well, God says there's a better way. And that way is through the cross. That way is through the resurrection. Perhaps you're here this morning and your relationship with God is not what it needs to be. Perhaps you want to strive for the greater Zion. Perhaps you've never been immersed for the forgiveness of your sins. Perhaps you've lost your way at some point. Well, that's what the opportunity is given here for this morning. Because just as Jesus is, you see throughout this lesson, it's not been a very pleasant portrayal of Jesus' opponents. They didn't respect His authority. They didn't respect what He had to say. Instead, they chose to get angry. But the message of the gospel, we have a choice as well. We can choose to get angry. We can choose to excuse ourselves. We can choose to go on living life as we see fit. Or we can recognize that I need to change some stuff in my life. I need to make myself a little bit more like Jesus than I am right now. Which will it be for you? I invite you to consider these questions, reflect on these things. And if there's any way we can help you this morning, let it be known. While together we stand and we say.